Hey, and welcome back to Flindog Woodwork. So in my early woodworking career, I made a lot of mistakes. Believe it or not, I was an even bigger idiot than I am today. However, a lot of these mistakes could have been prevented if I just would have known just a tad bit more. Today, we're going to look at 7 things that I did in my early woodworking career where I wish I would have chose a different path. Let's take a look at these 7 items and see if we can help you out if you're a beginning woodworker. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the saw. Now, in your early woodworking career, you may be bouncing back and forth about whether or not you want a miter saw or a table saw. For me, I decided to go with a miter saw, and I don't think this was the best choice. Let me show you exactly why. So if we take a closer look at my shop, you can see that the table saw is the foundation and the center of everything. And there's a reason for that. Let's talk about it. When you're first starting out, you're obviously not going to have a fancy table saw like a SawStop. However, there are a lot of affordable table saws out there that are contractor table saws. I started out with a DeWalt table saw, and it suited me very well for a number of years. When we take a look at the front of my shop, you can see that I still have one of my first miter saws and one of my first table saws. That's because these still serve a purpose even though I've upgraded both of these items. So in order to prove my point of why I think a table saw is a better option than a miter saw as your first major saw upgrade, let's talk about some of the features of what a miter saw can do. So in order to do this comparison, I'm going to take 2 pieces of 2x4s and do a variety of cuts at the miter saw. After that, we're going to take the second 2x4 and recreate those cuts at the table saw. Once that's done, I'm then going to show you some of the features that the table saw can do that the miter saw just can't handle. So one of the main features that we use a miter saw for is cross cuts. And a cross cut is simply a 90-degree cut through your wood to break your wood into smaller pieces. So one of the first disadvantages of having a miter saw is your cross cuts are limited to the capacity of your miter saw. So if I had a cross cut that was very wide, I couldn't do it with this miter saw. But as well as making cross cuts, as the name implies, miter saws are great at creating miter cuts. And a miter cut is simply just an angled cut. In this example, I'm going to cut a 45-degree angle. Not only do miter saws allow you to create vertical miters, but they also allow you to create horizontal miters. These are great for when cutting down things like moldings. One of the last features that I use a miter saw for on a regular basis is creating trenches. And trenches are simply creating rabbets or dados on a thicker piece of wood. By doing a trench, you don't go all the way through the wood, but only partially through the wood. So now that we've created this funky piece of wood, let's go over to the table saw and see if we can recreate these cuts. So the first cut that I'm going to recreate is a cross cut. Now this can easily be done either with a crosscut sled or a miter gauge. The only problem with a table saw, where the miter saw has an advantage, is you're limited to the length of the wood that you can cut at a table saw. So for this example, I'm going to use a miter gauge to create that crosscut. I've got my miter gauge set to 0, and I'm going to turn the saw on and simply make that cut. Now the next cut that I'm going to recreate is the miter cut. Now this is a vertical miter cut at 45 degrees. So let's go over to the table saw and make this cut. Now for this cut, I'm once again going to use my miter gauge. Now my miter gauge has got some positive stops, so I'm going to set it to 45 degrees and make the cut. So now that we've created the cross cut and the vertical miter cut, it's now time to take a look at the horizontal miter cut. Let's go over to the table saw and see how we make this cut. So this is a cut that's easily made with a high degree of precision if you have a digital angle finder. And that's what I'm going to use for this cut. So here I'm going to place my digital angle finder and zero it out. After that, I'm going to place it on the blade and rotate the blade until it hits that 45-degree angle. Now that I've got my blade set to 45 degrees, I've got my miter gauge set to 0 degrees. Now all that's left to do is to make the cut. So now if we take a look at the piece that we cut over at the miter saw, you can see that our table saw cuts are looking very similar. The only thing left to do is to do the trenching feature or create a dado on this workpiece. So let's go back to the table saw and create that dado. So here I've adjusted the blade back to 90 degrees and I've adjusted the depth of the blade so that it's equivalent to what we did over at the miter saw. Now all that's left to do is to make the cuts on the piece. So let's take a closer look at what we've just done. If we look at our original piece that we did at the miter saw, you can see that it's been perfectly replicated over at the table saw. We did our cross cut, we did our vertical miter cut, we did our horizontal miter cut, as well as the dado. And you can see that the table saw can do all of those things and more. So let's take a closer look at some of the other things that the table saw can do that the miter saw can't. So for this video, I'm only going to talk about a couple of the things that I use my table saw for on a regular basis that you can't do over at the miter saw. First and foremost, it's ripping. If you have a longer piece of wood that you need to cut the entire length of, you can only do this at the table saw. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So obviously at the table saw, I can cut down the entire length of this board by using my fence, and this is something you simply can't do over at the miter saw. The second thing that a table saw can do that a miter saw can't is long tapering cuts. Now this is a tapering jig that I made on a previous video, and this allows me to create those angled cuts for things like furniture legs. Let's cut through this and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So over at the table saw, you may be able to see that I can match that angle. However, since this piece of wood is so thick, there's no way I can cut through the entire board. The last thing that I want to talk about with the table saw is dado stacks. Now dado stacks I know are illegal in Europe. However, here in America, dado stacks are something that I use on a regular basis. In fact, my original table saw, I always have a dado stack set in there so that I can easily make the dados when I need them. Over here you can see at my original DeWalt table saw, I've got a 1/4 inch dado stack set in there and I can use it whenever I need it. Alright, so that's my first advice to any new woodworker is save up for that table saw. I think it really does pay off in the long run. Now let's move on to our second item. You ever feel like you're in prison in your workshop sometimes? I do. Let's talk about our next item. So when you first start woodworking, money is always an issue. You're not quite sure if this is a hobby you're really going to get into, so you typically migrate to the cheaper brands. And that's what I did. I set myself up with a bunch of Ryobi tools. Some are great, some are bad. Now let's talk about the infrastructure that supports those tools. So a lot of people have healthy hobbies like collecting stamps or toys. But for me, I've got a Ryobi collection. Let me tell you why I've got so many Ryobi tools. There's one reason and one reason only. So this right here is the reason why I have so many Ryobi tools. The first tool that I ever purchased was a Ryobi handsaw, and this required a Ryobi battery. So I purchased my first Ryobi handsaw and my first Ryobi battery. When it came to buy my second tool, it also required a Ryobi battery. So I purchased my second Ryobi battery and my second Ryobi tool. And then it started to snowball. Now I'm stuck with a Ryobi infrastructure that I'm not quite sure I can get out of. So what does all this mean? Well, if you're anything like me, I don't think most beginning woodworkers give a whole lot of thought to the infrastructure they're getting themselves into when they first start woodworking. Because I trap myself into a Ryobi infrastructure, I can no longer look at fancier tools like Milwaukee, DeWalt, or Makita. Then I was stuck with only the options that Ryobi had. In the long run, this actually cost me more money. Because I quickly realized I love woodworking, I quickly outgrew Ryobi. Now, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money on a new infrastructure with a company like DeWalt, Milwaukee, or Makita, so I jumped all the way up to Festool. And this has got a completely different battery infrastructure as well. So I ended up buying all new tools with Festool. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about Festool. I love Festool. However, I often wonder if I would have purchased a higher quality tool in the beginning and set myself up with a higher quality battery infrastructure if I would have moved to Festool or be with Makita or Bosch or one of those higher quality brands. So bottom line is, if you're thinking about getting into woodworking and you're not quite sure which brand you should go with, save up just a little extra cash and go with a higher quality brand. Because once you get that battery infrastructure in place, it's really hard to get out of the brand you start with. God forbid, you may even go down the Ryobi rabbit hole so far, you end up with a Ryobi drill press. So that covers our first two mistakes that I made in early woodworking. Those were major infrastructure mistakes. Now let's talk about some of the smaller mistakes that I didn't quite know about as a beginning woodworker. Before we do that though, I ask you to do me a huge favor. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like, as it really does help out this small channel and my subscriber base is really growing. The community around the subscriber base has really been a positive influence on me, and I think it will be a positive influence for you as well. So woodworkers need squares. The first two squares that I ever purchased were these two right here, and these were a mistake. Let me talk about some of the disadvantages of these two squares and the squares you should purchase instead. So let's take a closer look at this larger square. If we wanted to strike a perpendicular line on this MDF, we would rest the square on the very edge of the MDF. Then we would strike our line. The problem with squares like this, though, is there's no support for your square. When you set it against the edge of the workpiece, it can fall down and create inaccuracies. If I were to create a line using this square with it resting against the edge, I can strike a line right here. If I were to just wiggle it just a tad and place another line, you can see that these two lines are out of square. Here's a closer look at the variation between these two lines with just a little bit of deviation on the bottom of the square. So there's a really easy solution for this, and that's the simple speed square. Let me show you how the speed square provides the support to the square that you need to have those accurate 90-degree angles. So unlike the framing square, the speed square has got a lip on the very edge. This allows you to actually rest it against your workpiece and place it firmly against the wood. Then you can strike a line and you can vary it wherever you want, and you'll know that those two lines are perfectly perpendicular to the edge of your workpiece. It's this little lip on the edge of the speed square that allows the speed square to have complete support along the length of the square so that you can make sure that your lines are perfectly perpendicular. As your woodworking skills increase, you may invest in some nice squares like these woodpecker squares. You will notice that each one of these squares has that little lip to give support of the entire frame of the square on the workpiece. So unless you plan on framing out a house in the near future, these are simply nice little rulers. If you're planning on doing some woodworker, the speed square is the one that I recommend. So now let's talk about sanding. Now I know everybody hates sanding, including myself, and that's why I purchased this next tool. I thought by having this tool in my shop, I would be able to eliminate a step in my woodworking builds and not have to do that rough sanding that everybody hates to do. Let's go take a closer look at it and I'll show you some of the limitations of this tool. So here's my drum sander. Now I purchased this thinking I would save myself a step in my milling process right after I got things out of the planer just to give it a little softer edge. Now this isn't what this tool is used for, and I didn't know that at the time. Let me show you exactly what I use this tool for and what I should have purchased instead. If we take a closer look at the drum sander, you can see that it's basically just a large cylinder with some sandpaper on it. Now I typically keep 80 grit sandpaper on this at all times. I use my drum sander for two things and two things only. The first thing is when I'm doing end grain cutting boards. If I want to smooth out those end grains, this is the perfect tool to use instead of that planer. The second thing that I use this for is when I'm doing veneers. If I have a thin strip of wood that I want to apply to a project, this is the perfect thing to do those thin strips. Now instead of buying a drum sander to smooth down large surfaces of wood, I should have bought a large orbital sander, and that's what I purchased shortly after purchasing this drum sander. Let me show you what I purchased instead and does the trick that I was looking for. So what I should have purchased instead of buying a drum sander was a large orbital sander. Now this is a 6-inch sander made by Festool, and I don't recommend a Festool sander right off the bat. However, you can find cheaper brands in the 6-inch and even larger varieties that will do just as good a job. So with the drum sander, there's only one grit of sandpaper installed at any time. If you need to change that sandpaper, it's quite the process. But with a large orbital sander, it acts as any other orbital sander. If you need to change your grits, you simply pull off the old one and install a new one. So unless you're doing a lot of cutting boards or a lot of veneers in your shop right off the bat, I don't recommend a drum sander. A drum sander is a great asset to have in your shop, but not something you need as a beginning woodworker. Since we're on the topic of sanding, I want to move on to the next mistake I made as an early woodworker and show you a tool that I purchased that was way too powerful for the job it was intended for. So once again, me being lazy, I wanted to cover as much surface area with my sanding as possible, and that's why I purchased this large belt sander from Ryobi. Let me show you the disadvantages of this tool and how it can really damage your projects. So one of the main problems with these belt sanders is they're very powerful and they're hard to keep completely flat. If you have just a little twist in your arm, you can create a divot in your workpiece. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here I've got a piece of plywood clamped down to my assembly table. I'm going to take this belt sander and do some even sanding back and forth across this plywood. I'm going to show you how uneven that sanding is and where there may be some divots. Now this isn't going to show up on the camera very well, but I sanded this back and forth quite evenly for about 30 seconds. Now as I rub my fingers back and forth, I can feel little areas where divots were created. This is because it's very difficult with this large sander to keep even pressure across your workpiece as you're sanding back and forth. To show you even further how powerful this belt sander is, I'm going to place the belt sander on the top of this plywood and just let it sit for a moment. And hopefully you can see from this angle here how uneven that sanding actually is. So once again, instead of being lazy and trying to do large surfaces with this belt sander, I should have made the smart choice and purchased an orbital sander. Here I've got a 5-inch orbital sander, which does a great job. These things are fairly inexpensive, and for the price you just can't beat them. These do even sanding across your workpiece, and it's much more difficult to create those divots like you can with this belt sander. So that's enough about sanding. Let's move on to something that's a little different, and that's the screw. When I first started woodworking, I thought there was no difference between any other screws on the market, but that's just not true. Let's go take a look at it. So when I first started woodworking, I had it all figured out. Phillips head screws were the way to go. Most of my screwdrivers were Phillips head screwdrivers. Most of my bits for my impact driver were Phillips head bits, but boy did I have it wrong. Let's talk a little bit more about it. So I rummaged through my entire inventory of screws, and I only found one box of Phillips head screws, and there's a reason for that. There's a better screw, and that's the star screw. Let's take a closer look and let me show you why the star screw is so much better than a Phillips head screw. So the difference between a Phillips head screw and a star screw has everything to do with the points of contact with your bit. A star screw has 6 points of contact, while a Phillips head screw only has 4 points of contact. This becomes incredibly important when screwing into things that are extremely dense, such as hardwoods. When you're using your impact driver, since there's 6 points of contact, there's a lot less likelihood of that screw becoming stripped. And there's nothing more frustrating than having a stripped screw in your workpiece just as you're finishing up your project. So now it's time for our last item of this video. Before we move on to that, once again, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, as it really does help out this channel. Let's see what our last item is. In order to be a good woodworker, you gotta have a nice set of hammers and nails, of course. Nope, believe it or not, that's just not true. Along my woodworking journey, I realized that I only used 3 sets of fasteners. A, wood glue, B, screws, and C, pin nails. Let's talk about pin nails. So since I was locked into the Ryobi infrastructure of batteries, I purchased this Airstrike pin nailer very early in my woodworking career. Now I purchased this to put up some walling in my house, however I found this to be very useful in my workshop. Let me show you why. Now there's one thing that I really like about this nailer, and that's that it's cordless. Now if you don't have a cordless nailer that's ran by a battery, you typically have to buy an air compressor. But this one comes with a battery and it's super easy to use. So this nailer has 2 main purposes in my shop. First and foremost, if I have 2 pieces of wood that I've glued together and I'm in a hurry, I can use this nailer to secure those 2 pieces of wood together and know that they're not going to come apart without using clamps. The second purpose of this nailer in my shop is often used when creating jigs. If I want to create a temporary joint between 2 pieces of wood, this thing does the trick and it's easy to do. Well, that's going to do us for today, folks. I really hope you enjoyed watching these 7 mistakes that I made in my early woodworking career. If you're just starting out, hopefully you can learn from these mistakes, or if you've been around the block for a while, maybe you made some of these same mistakes yourself. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.